Hey gamers, Treantmonk here. This week we're going to talk about races. This is going to be kind of a quick video because there's not a huge number of races I want to talk about, but what I do want to do is I want to talk about those races and how they might work to help you fit your wizard into the roles that we talked about for wizard last week. So, welcome to Treantmonk's Guide to Wizards. So before we get into the specific races, I want to talk a little bit in generality about intelligence bonus to racial ability scores. Because I mentioned before that maybe with a wizard it's not quite as important as it is for other characters. So let me explain why that is. So let's say for a moment you're playing a rogue. So what are you going to be doing in combat? Well, maybe you're going to be firing a bow. And so then dexterity becomes your primary ability score. Now every round you use that bow, that dexterity is going to affect your chance to hit and your damage. So it is vital. So if you play something that doesn't get a bonus to dexterity, then that dexterity is going to be behind right through till 12th level, which is the earliest you could possibly get it to a 20. That means for 12 levels, every round of combat, you're going to be worse than you otherwise would. So that's pretty devastating. With a wizard, it's a little bit different, and the reason it's different is because not every spell we cast is going to rely on our intelligence. Now, a lot of spells are going to rely on it to hit roll for intelligence, so something like a firebolt, for example, but these tend to be cantrips. So this is the stuff that we're using at very low levels. And then there's going to be lots of spells at every level that provide saving throws. And anytime you cast a spell that provides a saving throw, then that will be worse if your intelligence isn't as high as it could be. But then again, there are lots of spells in the game that wizards can cast that you will want to cast that won't rely on your intelligence at all. Let me give you just a few examples. Right at level 1, you might cast something like Sleep. You might cast something like Magic Missile. In both those cases, intelligence isn't going to affect the spell at all. And that's going to continue on, because we're going to get into buffing spells like a fly spell, or maybe a ritual spell like a Lehman's Tiny Hut, or maybe a buff like an improved invisibility, or maybe battlefield control like a Wall of Force. Lots of different spells we might choose that won't be affected by our intelligence. Now, there's no way you're going to make a wizard that doesn't rely on its intelligence at all. There's always going to be some need to cast those kinds of spells. So you will be worse some of the time. So the best races you can pick are going to be the races that have a bonus of 2 intelligence. So I'm not going to talk about those other races today. But what I do want to say is if you have a concept, you want to play a Goliath wizard, and Goliaths don't get bonus to intelligence, don't think that doesn't mean you can be effective. You're going to want to be careful with your spell selection, and you're going to want to employ tactics where you're going to concentrate more on those kind of spells, the spells that don't rely on intelligence. Now, you will still sometimes have to use the spells that rely on intelligence, and you'll be worse than you otherwise would be. But it won't be every round, it won't be all the time. And that's why I think you can still be reasonably effective. So with a wizard, if you have a racial concept that you are excited about, I say do it. But today what I want to talk about are mechanics, and we're just going to talk about the best races to fill those wizard roles we talked about last week, and those races are always going to be the ones with bonuses to intelligence. So let's get started on that right now. So one thing I mentioned last week was that the wizard was reasonably good at filling the tank role, because you can play something like a Bladesinger that gets good bonuses to defense, or you might play an Abjurer and then you take advantage of Arcane Ward for additional defense. But in some of these cases, race is very important. So if you're going to play a Bladesinger, the race that I'm obviously going to recommend is High Elf. High Elf is going to be the best choice here. You're going to get a +1 to your intelligence, a +2 to your dexterity. So those are both great. It means you're probably going to be able to start with a 16 in each, and that's definitely what you want to do. You're going to get Dark Vision. You're going to get an extra cantrip. That cantrip is based on your intelligence, so that's good. You're going to get Perception Skill for free. And then you're going to get things like Fey Ancestry and Trance. Those are kind of minor abilities. And you're going to get Weapon Training, which is going to give you Longbow proficiency. So now you can take Rapier with your Bladesinger, and then you get Longbow with your Elf. So now, whether you're going into melee or you're staying at range, you have an appropriate weapon to use. And that will continue past the point where you get the extra attack, because that's when a crossbow isn't so good anymore. Now, the other option here is a half-elf, and a half-elf isn't a bad option. I don't think it's as strong as the high elf, but there's still a number of things going for it. you get that +2 bonus to Charisma, and that's a little bit wasted because Charisma isn't an important ability score for us. But we do get +1 to 2 other ability scores. So we can still get a bonus to our Intelligence, we can still get a bonus to our Dexterity. So depending the way we're developing our ability scores, that might be enough. We get 2 additional proficiencies, so we'll take Perception with 1, and then we'll get 1 other, and that's a nice thing to have. We're still getting our Dark Vision, and we're still getting our Fey Ancestry. So I think we get a little bit less here, but overall, it's not a bad option if Half-Elf is what you want to play. Now, if you want to play the Abjurer, who's using Arcane Ward, one race to really look at is the Deep Gnome, and this is going to involve an exploit. So there's a feat for the Deep Gnome called Svirfneblin Magic. I think I pronounced that right, Svirfneblin. Anyway, that's the real name for Deep Gnomes, and this feat gives them the ability to cast a few spells. The most important of these is non-detection, because you can cast it at will, and it's a 3rd level abjuration spell. So that means we can use this to buff up our Arcane Ward as often as we need it. So in between combat, you can always get it back up to maximum. Now again, this is a bit of a loophole. I don't think the designers intended for us to use infinite ways to improve our Arcane Ward, but it's there, and I'd be neglectful not to mention that that option is there. So you can play a Deep Gnome, cast non-detection at will. You'll have to wait till you get a feat. You got to take that as a feat, which means 4th level. But once you get that at 4th level, then you can get your Arcane Ward set up and recharged very easily. I also want to talk about the Githyanki. The Githyanki is very strong in a tank role. And you could do this either with an Abjurer, where you're taking advantage of Arcane Ward. Of course, there's no exploit there. You're just using it normally. Or through Warmage, because Warmage, of course, has that Arcane Deflection, and we can use that as additional defense. The thing about Githyanki is we're getting proficiency in medium armor. So that means we can wear half plate. So when we make our character, we're going to have a +2 bonus to strength and a +1 bonus to intelligence. So we can get our intelligence to 16, and we can probably get our strength to 16 too. And then we want to try to get a dexterity of 14. And the reason we want the dexterity of 14 is then we put that on with half plate. That gives us a very strong armor class. And then we can use things like shield spell on top of that. They're proficient in great swords, so we have a decent weapon, we have a decent strength to use it, and a pretty good armor class. Now, we really have to dump on our other ability scores to get those ability scores where they need to be. So our Constitution isn't going to be as high as we would like it, and then we're probably just going to have to outright dump our Wisdom and Charisma. Another nice thing about playing a Githyanki is you get the Githyanki Psionics. So that essentially gives us some additional spells. We're going to be able to cast the Mage Hand cantrip for free. Plus, we're going to get 1 use of the Jump spell and eventually 1 use of the Misty Step spell. Now, the Jump spell is pretty circumstantial, but Misty Step's a solid spell, and you're getting it with an extra spell slot, so that's very useful for you. So overall, if we're taking that kind of role, Githyanki is a good choice. Now, if you want to play a Blaster, or you want to play a God Wizard, or some combination of the two, then these are the races you probably want to look at. The first, again, is the High Elf. High Elf is still a strong race for that role as well. And we already discussed all the reasons why they were good in the Bladesinger role, and they're just as good in the God Wizard role. They're just as good as an Evoker, all for the same reasons. Now let's talk about gnomes. Now there's 3 kinds of gnomes. I talked about deep gnomes a bit already, but all gnomes get a +2 bonus to intelligence, and then they either get a bonus to constitution or dexterity, and either of those is just fine. So the deep gnome first, one of the big advantages is you get 120-foot dark vision, and you don't have light sensitivity, and that combination just doesn't happen. So that is very nice to have, especially if you're playing, I find if I play online and you have something like dynamic lighting, then vision ranges and light ranges really come into play, and they end up being played to the T, and you'll notice that 120-foot dark vision is going to be way superior to a 60-foot dark vision. Now the stone camouflage gives you advantage to hide in rocky terrain. That's pretty circumstantial, not really our stick. That would be more useful for something like a rogue, somebody with cunning action. For us, it'll be okay. I mean, we'll probably want to find a way to get proficiency in stealth to take advantage of that, but it's not going to come up very often. Now, the forest gnome has dexterity instead of constitution, and frankly, I think dexterity is a little bit better than constitution. Another thing is you get the minor illusion cantrip for free, and you were going to take the minor illusion cantrip, so that is an extra cantrip. And finally, you can communicate with small beasts. A circumstantial ability. but that can be useful from time to time. And finally, then there's the Rock Gnome. And the Rock Gnome gets a Constitution bonus like the Deep Gnome. I just don't think they get as much as the Deep Gnome. I think the Deep Gnome is just straight better than the Rock Gnome. The Rock Gnome gets some very circumstantial racial abilities. They get advantage on some history rolls and very circumstantial ones, and then they get their ability to make their little tinker things. And that can be fun from a role-playing perspective. And I'm not saying that the Rock Gnome isn't a good choice. It is still a good choice for Wizard, but of the three gnome varieties, I consider it to maybe be the third best. Now, all gnomes are going to have at least some form of dark vision, so that's good. Also, all gnomes are going to get advantage on certain types of saves versus magic. I believe you get charisma, intelligence, and wisdom saving throws. Now, your intelligence and charisma saving throws just aren't happening very often, so it's the wisdom saving throws that's kind of the big deal, but that does give you a nice defense. Now let's talk about the downsides of playing a gnome, because there's more than you think. The most obvious one is that you have a 25-foot movement rate. So reducing your movement rate, of course, isn't a good thing. It's not the end of the world, but it does limit where you can go. But for me, the big downside of playing a gnome is their size. The size of small makes it so that spells like Thunderstep and Dimension Door don't work as well, because you can take a passenger with those spells, but only one of your size or smaller. So if you are playing a gnome god wizard and you need to pull somebody out of combat, you can no longer use those spells unless they're small too. So that can create a real problem. Now, if you've got a party that's all small, maybe you're a bunch of gnomes and halflings and goblins, then there's no problem. But assuming you're playing in a regular party where most of the characters are medium sized, this limits two of the very important spells for maneuverability and your ability to use them. And that really kind of sucks. It's enough to kind of sour me on playing small wizards altogether. Now, don't get me wrong, you wouldn't even necessarily have to take those spells. It's just, personally, those are two of my favorite spells, and the ability to bring somebody out of danger is one of my primary uses of those favorite spells, and then that gets taken away from me for playing a gnome. So that is a big downside for me, and it sours me a bit. Still, despite that, I think overall gnomes are still worthy of recommendation as a wizard. Just be aware that that limitation's in play. Now let's talk about the Variant Human. Variant Human makes a fantastic god wizard because they can start with that feat at level 1, which means they can mitigate concentration saves right at level 1. Now, when we make a wizard that's not a Variant Human, when we get to level 4, we're really going to have to think about whether we want to raise our intelligence or we want a feat that's going to mitigate concentration saves. But with a Variant Human, we already have that intelligence of 16 and the ability to mitigate concentration saves. So when we get to level 4, we can definitely raise our intelligence to 18. And then when we get to level 8, we can definitely raise it to 20. So a lot of other wizards aren't going to have that 20 intelligence at level 8, and you will as a Variant Human, and that's a big advantage playing a Variant Human character. Now, there's not a lot of racial abilities. You get additional skill proficiency, but that's not a big deal because we're a spellcaster, so there's all kinds of abilities that we can basically duplicate with spell use. And then we get the +1 to 2 ability scores. That's less than what we're going to get with other races, but it is enough so that we can get a +1 to our intelligence to get it to a 16, and then we can put a +1 in either our constitution or dexterity. We should be able to get both of those to 14 comfortably. Now, the additional skill proficiency, obviously I'm going to recommend Perception, and for the free feat, the feat I would probably recommend is Warcaster, just because advantage is going to be bigger deal at lower levels. Resilient Con is something we might want to look at higher levels, like level 12 or level 16, but that Warcaster, that advantage on those rolls at low levels just tends to give you more successes on concentration saves. Now, I just want to talk about the Tiefling for a moment here. Generally speaking, I don't think the Tiefling is particularly strong for wizards. They get a bunch of spells that rely on their charisma, unfortunately. That's not going to be a great stat for us. And then they get a charisma bonus. That's not a big thing for us. They do get a bonus to intelligence, so they're okay as a wizard. But one exception to that is the winged Tiefling. If your DM doesn't mind people playing with wings, then giving up those spells that rely on charisma for a set of wings is a terrific deal. So now you're playing a character that has wings and an intelligence bonus. The only way you're going to get that combination in the game. And being able to fly without concentration is really, really powerful. I'm surprised that races like Aarakocra and things like winged tieflings are just thrown in as just another racial feature, because flight is normally a third level spell that requires concentration. Being able to do it without concentration from level 1 is huge. So let's talk about the Hobgoblin for a second. Hobgoblin makes a surprisingly strong wizard. I generally think of Hobgoblins more like Roman centurions or something, but as wizards, whether it's a god wizard or it's an evoker blaster, terrific choice. You're getting that +1 to intelligence and a +2 to constitution. So the ability score bonuses are right where you want them. You get dark vision, you get shoring up. This is an ability where if you fail an attack roll or a saving throw, you can apply a bonus, and that bonus is based on the number of allies in sight. The thing is that gives you another way to shore up your concentration saves right from level 1. So that's a lovely ability for a wizard to have. Now you get 2 martial weapon proficiencies. One of the ones I would recommend is heavy crossbow. Heavy crossbow, especially at low levels before your cantrips become more effective, it's probably going to be your best attack in combat. You get a d10 plus your dexterity bonus. That's probably just going to be more damage than you're going to be able to do with any cantrip in the game. And finally, you get the light armor proficiency. Now, at really, really low levels, it's difficult for a wizard to cast mage armor because they'll only have 2 or 3 spell slots, and those go really fast. And if you're going to use one for mage armor, that really hurts. So if you can put on studded leather and you get a +2 AC, then that can save you that spell slot, and that's pretty useful. Later in the game, of course, magic studded leather might be better than mage armor. So again, useful for you to have, and it's always going to be at least 1 spell slot you save. Yeah, it's only a first level spell slot, but that's a shield spell. So I do think that light armor proficiency does provide some benefit. It's not huge. The other thing I would be thinking about is once we have our intelligence up to 20 and we're looking at other feats, we qualify for the moderately armored feat. The moderately armored feat isn't just going to allow us to wear half plate, it'll allow us to use a shield as well. So then we can get a very good armor class, and then we have the shield spell on top of that. So overall, Hobgoblin is a great choice for Wizard. Now let's talk about the Yuan-ti. Wizard isn't the best role for Yuan-ti, but they're pretty good at it. They get the bonus to intelligence. Now there are other bonuses to charisma, which isn't particularly useful to us, but at least we can get our intelligence of 16. But here's the reasons why Yuan-ti is something to consider. Poison immunity, poison condition immunity, and advantage on saves versus spells. All very nice abilities to have. Unfortunately, they get some spells, but they're all based on a charisma, which isn't ideal for us, but still, overall, a reasonable race to choose. And finally, I'll mention the Githyanki one more time. I do think they're particularly well made to fill that tank role, but do I want to give my God Wizard half plate? Yes, I do. And because we get the +1 intelligence, we can still get a 16 intelligence. The +2 strength bonus is wasted, unfortunately. But yeah, we're getting half plate, we're getting our bonus to intelligence, we're getting extra spells. So overall, a really nice mix. Still makes this a good choice even for a God Wizard or an Evoker. So as I said, this was a short one today. We're just going through those races that I recommend, and that's all of them. Again, if there is another race you really want to play, you want to play a Firbolg Wizard, go for it. I think it could still work out reasonably well for you. This isn't a list of races you must choose from. They're just the ones I think tend to be mechanically strongest. Are there races that you think are particularly good for Wizards? Let me know in the comments down below. Next week we'll meet back here to talk about feats, and until then, I'm going to sit back and I'm going to relax. And I'm going to have some fun, because D&D is for everyone, and I'll see you guys next week.